Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're here today to hear from Maria Jessop. My name is Shayna Hebert. I'm from Jesuit Refugee Service, USA, and I'm pleased to be here to talk to Maria Jessop, who has been doing some very interesting work with civil society organizations in Haiti. Maria is a senior program officer with the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding of the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she conducts education and training programs in conflict and post-conflict contexts. Ms. Jessop has led USIP's civic and human rights education projects in Iraq since 2008. As part of the State Department's Africa Contingency Operation Training and Assistance, ACOTA program, she regularly conducts negotiation training in Africa for UN Peacekeeping Officers. Ms. Jessop also specializes in facilitated dialogue approaches to resolving intergroup conflict, fostering reconciliation, and engaging civil society. Ms. Jessop has also trained civil society leaders in Iraq, Colombia, and Haiti in facilitated dialogue and teaches a course on intergroup dialogue at USIP's Academy in Washington, D.C. Prior to USIP, Ms. Jessop was a mediator, facilitator, and cross-cultural specialist. She founded the Dialogue Development Group at American University, which engages the university community in facilitated intergroup dialogues on topics related to social identities, differences, and inequalities. Ms. Jessop served in the Peace Corps in St. Lucia, and she holds a BA in psychology and an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University. She's fluent in French and in Spanish. I'm very excited to hear about your work in Haiti today. As international NGOs with grassroots affiliates in Haiti, we in our community here have called for the Haitian government and the international community to ensure that grassroots civil society actors have an effective role in the relief and reconstruction process in Haiti. Understanding the history of civil society in Haiti, which is only just beginning to gain strength since its systematic and ruthless repression under the Duvaliers, has led many groups to call for methods to engage and promote the capacity of Haitian civil society to rebuild the fabric of Haitian society, bolster citizen security, and systematically participate in policy discussions. Maria Jessop, in her role as senior program advisor officer at Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding at USIP, teamed up with National Democratic Institute to mobilize and train a local civil society network in Haiti to prevent election-related violence in their communities. Potential for violence was high amid an already tense environment and slow and arduous efforts to rebuild after Haiti's devastating earthquake in January 2010. Today, Ms. Jessop will describe the training initiative and its impacts to date. She will also discuss the challenges and opportunities faced by civil society organizations in preventing conflict and promoting dialogue in Haiti. Before I let you begin to share your experience, I wanted to start with some foundational questions that I hope will help to guide the discussion. I would ask that you define for us what you mean when you speak of Haitian civil society, that you explain why USIP decided to work with civil society organizations and the utility that USIP views in working with civil society groups to ensure peace and security in communities in Haiti. I'd like to also know how USIP chose to work with the groups that you work with, and whether you think that it's necessary to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate actors when you're choosing to work in the civil society context.
Okay. Well, the way we see civil society, basically, or the way I look at it, I shouldn't say that I speak for everyone at the Institute. Civil society are organized groups that are trying to do something constructive for their country. They can be voluntary organizations. They can be related to churches and schools and other community organizations. And they generally, genuine, legitimate civil society organizations are ones that spring from a spirit of volunteerism, I think, people who want to do something for their community, who have the ability to organize around a particular issue and do something constructive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way I see it. Why did USIP get involved in this project? Well, this was actually a project that was started by NDI, National Democratic Institute, that's been working in Haiti for a long time. And they've been working with a group, a civil society network, that they've been fostering and educating and working with for over 10 years now. They have been chiefly involved with civic education and giving them the ability to be more informed about the political process, to engage in the political process, and so forth. After the earthquake in January, they sort of mobilized on their own. They jumped in to help in that situation. And they have, what we've learned from NDI and from talking and now working ourselves with them is that they are very often seen as a resource for many things in their community, and one is preventing conflict, resolving conflicts that erupt. Mm-hmm. They're genuinely people who are respected by others in their community. They often have the title of what they call notable, people who are just have earned the title of being a respected member of the community because they're trusted and they have character, moral authority, and so forth. And so the idea was that NDI was already working with them to engage people in dialogue and to try to have them be more of a voice, to connect their voice of their community, especially in rural areas, and connect it more with both local government actors and national government actors. Mm-hmm. This is what they've been trying to do. It's been a challenge for a lot of reasons. But they also saw the need to improve their skills in conflict resolution and prevention. Because of the very difficult circumstances that Haitians find themselves now, and it breeds a lot of frustration, and sometimes that frustration spills over into violence. We saw it most recently after the elections, or in the results of the first round of elections in November last year, when violence broke out in a number of communities, and we know that Haiti has a history of this, and the idea was to be proactive and to try to see what these initiative committees, that's what they call them, could do in order to try to prevent outbreaks of violence. So that was the genesis.
Okay.
Okay.
And so then, how did you? Well, I guess NDI had chosen these groups.
Yes, so NDI had chosen the groups. They had been working with them for quite a while, so they were vetted, if you will.
And what type of, can you give a few examples of the groups that you were working with?
Sure. First of all, these initiative committees are actually networks that represent, they're committees that have representatives from various civil society organizations in the country and in that community. So I'm sorry, your question was?
If you could give some examples of
what kinds of
groups they were. So, are these the representatives? Are they from religious organizations? Are they from
they run the
agricultural?
Gamut. They run the gamut of organizations, that work on the community level. They tended to be, and they ranged in age, the people that we worked with, from 20s on to 60s. They, some of them are educators, some of them are unemployed, admittedly. Some of them are working in just in subsistence kind of work. It runs the gamut. But I have to say that they are part of an elite, if you will, in Haiti, in that they are literate, Only, you know, there's a huge amount of illiteracy in Haiti. I think it's 60%, I believe now, illiteracy. And they are French-speaking, which only about 10% of Haitians are French-speaking, most speak Creole. So the fact that they fall into that camp, they can be considered elite to some extent.
And what did you see in terms of gender diversity?
That was a bit of a disappointment to me, to tell you the truth. There were, in the first group that we talked with, we had 25 in the first group, and we only had 2 women. In the second group, we had 4 women. And it was, I don't think that's reflective of Haitian civil society. We know that there are many women's groups that are mobilizing, particularly after the earthquake, and that have been very active. And I'm not sure I know exactly why that dynamic played out, other than traditional reasons of sort of it being a male-dominated society, you know, and like many. So
yeah.
So
maybe you can go into detail about your work. And
well, I guess I kind of wanted to, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think this work is important, and why I got a sense of hope and a sense of potential from this experience of working with these groups. Just to take a moment to bring the audience in here, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you think of Haiti? Just earthquake, okay. Poverty.
A beautiful country.
Beautiful country. Are you from there? Have you been there?
No.
Okay, good. But that's nice to know. Anybody else? Okay. I mean, generally, when you ask most people what the first word that comes into their mind, it's usually something negative. It's very rarely it's a beautiful country. It's usually poverty, basket case, and our perception of Haiti is one of helplessness very often. And that's certainly the perception that I think the media gives us. Obviously, there are great and grave problems in Haiti, and they've existed for generations. They were compounded by the earthquake. Those are real, and I don't mean to diminish those problems, the extent of them. But there's another side to the story of Haiti that rarely gets attention, that there isn't a lot of focus on, and that is basically the capacity of civil society, which right now is feeling quite excluded in general from reconstruction efforts, excluded from both the international community's efforts to engage in Haiti, and it's always been excluded from government. So it's, and you know, there are many reasons for this, but what I have learned from my experience there, which is not extensive, I think Shana has a great deal more experience in Haiti, is that the perception is belied by what you see on the ground in terms of people actually engaging. I mean, the people that I worked with, which through this initiative, which was about creating, improving conflict mitigation skills, but also improving their ability to engage their communities in dialogue so that they could prevent conflict. So for instance, after the first workshop, which we held in September, I went back for a second workshop in February for another group from the South. And I had the opportunity to meet with several members from the first workshop to see what they were doing and what they had been done after the training. I wanted to get a sense of what the impact had been. And I was gratified because I had learned that they had organized these multi-sectoral dialogues in their communities that engaged political party supporters, engaged local government, education folks, religious leaders, and some of them had, for instance, talked about organize these events around the idea of educating people not only about the voting process, but also to spread the message of nonviolence, of how can we work together so this is a peaceful election, and so forth. And what struck me, and it validated my belief in the power of dialogue and the power of engaging on the community level, is what I learned was that in the communities where they held these dialogues, there was little to no incidents of violence. We know that, and this is what struck me. Most people do not want to resort to violence. Usually when people resort to violence, it's because they're frustrated, denied, and don't have an outlet for expression, don't have an outlet to get their needs met. And so the role that the civil society can play is in engaging people is actually to get them connected, to have them feel connected as a community. They may not get all the resources they need, but at least if they are reached out to and connected and have an ability to talk and express their needs and also work together about how they can meet their own needs, it diffuses a lot of the frustration. So this is one of the potential of this work. The other thing I know is that obviously a lot of people see the need for jobs in Haiti. They put the stress on the fact that we have, there's huge unemployment. There's the need for all this institutional reform. Obviously, it's been plagued by poor governance for generations. People talk a lot about institutional reform, and yes, we need institutional reform, but that's something that takes decades, right? And it hasn't, and the way it's happened up till now hasn't worked. Why? In my view, it's because civil society is not engaged enough in the process. They are not, they are the ones that can hold government accountable. They are the ones that can hold institutions accountable. They are the ones also that, I mean, we forget also in our own country the process that it took for our institutions to be formed, for our institutions to be held accountable. And the process that it took in our country is it took people and an engaged citizenry who said, we need these institutions, we need these protections, we need these services, and asking for them and getting it made. It was a process. We forget the process.
Yeah.
So this is by way of saying that not only Haitian society, civil society has a role to prevent conflict in this very difficult and challenging recovery process, they also they are there for the long term. They are there, and this is, I guess, a plea to sort of not only support what they do and do capacity building, but validate what they are doing and to actually put some more attention on that, so that people realize that to also counter that perception that Haitians are helpless and it's just a basket case.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that a lot of us have been really trying to engage on since before the earthquake, but certainly since the earthquake, especially relief organizations that have civil society partners on the ground and who have felt completely excluded from the process of rebuilding. And I'm wondering if you have had a success with taking this message to international donors or to the State Department and encouraging them to really make a concerted and systematic effort to engage not only civil society actors in Port-au-Prince, but also to decentralize their efforts.
Decentralize their efforts. I haven't had that opportunity yet, but if any of you work on the Hill and would like to invite me to speak to talk about that, I'd be happy to go and make that and take that message. I think it's an important message.
Yeah. Well, do you want to take questions from the audience? I know you wanted to have a kind of loose discussion format. Yeah?
Sure. Question. DC Historical Society here in Washington. If your people are elite, French-speaking and literate and whatever, does that mean that they have much contact with the local people? I mean, it's if you're dealing with a very elite group, are they able to really reach out and contact and communicate with local people?
Oh no, these are, when I say elite, I use a term in it's relative. I mean elite because they are privileged in the sense that they have had some education and are literate and so forth. But these are grassroots people. These are people who are living in the towns and communities in Haiti and who are very connected on the local level. So yes, they're trusted in their communities.
Yes.
My question is, you hear a lot about corruption because the resources that have been allocated by the large, a lot of philanthropic efforts have been diverted corruptedly. So it's not actually reaching grassroots communities the way that they intended. Is there some intentionality about how they are allocating not only the basic sustenance type food, housing, shelter, but also these types of conflict resolution, mediation type groups or workshops or some facilitated non-violence training? Is there something that's being done so that that's funded properly, or does that need more attention?
So that those kinds of trainings are funded, or
Right.
and
I mean, what could be done to address both the corruption problem, the money not getting where it's supposed to, and then diverting it appropriately into these types of efforts?
Mhm.
Because obviously there's a lot of need for just basically feeding people. There's housing that's just getting washed away down hillsides.
Mhm.
Tent villages still years after years, right? I mean, when
1
was
year.
it? A year.
Yeah.
1 year, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Tent villages still exist. People aren't in housing,
right.
and they're starving.
Yeah.
And malaria and other TB diseases, right? So, what could be done to get some resources? If people are talking about the money not getting to these grassroots, obviously there's a problem in the funnel, right? And what should we do?
Well, a lot of aid was held up because Haiti did not have a government that was considered could be a trusted partner for the international NGOs, and so there was a lot of things that was held up waiting for the elections and so forth, and which have now completed. Shana mentioned the need for decentralization of aid. That's part of the solution. Certainly, that a lot of things get centralized in focal plants and they don't make their way. Yes, corruption is a huge problem. Haiti is I think at the top of almost at the top of the list in terms of corruption on the Transparency International's site. Now that the elections are over, that pretty much took over everything, and it also stalled everything in terms of development. I think there's going to be renewed attention now to reconstruction, and this is the time now that the international NGOs have to bring in the local NGOs and actually dialogue with them, and also to get their view on how the aid should be distributed. I want to invite Shana also to respond to the question, because her organization does a lot of work in that area in terms of
accountability of aid and transparency of aid. I mean, this is something that, Ian and I and others in the international NGO community have been working on for quite some time. We are extremely concerned that that a lot of the aid that is being sent to Haiti doesn't work to really build the capacity of the Haitian people to hold their own government accountable. It's concerning when aid is just sent to international NGOs and really isn't, when there really isn't very much energy being concentrated in making people understand, helping people to understand systems of accountability and systems for distributing aid and how to engage in the process. You can't just throw money at the problem, and a lot of times that's how things have been done in Haiti. It really does take a concerted effort both to make a population more literate so that they can engage. Literacy is, as you said, an incredible problem in Haiti because without being a literate population, people are unaware of the tools at their disposal to engage with authority figures. But the fact also that grassroots organizations are really not part of the aid distribution process, because all of the conversations about aid distribution happen in Port-au-Prince, and not just in Port-au-Prince, but in UN compound in Port-au-Prince. That's a huge problem in terms of ensuring that there's real citizen participation and citizen security. I was wondering actually if you could address the ways in which civil society organizations help to build citizen security on kind of an interpersonal level.
I mean, we all know that security depends on a lot of things being in place, and certainly respect for rule of law and police presence and so forth. Police presence is completely inadequate in Haiti, unfortunately. They are, the numbers are just not there. The rule of law is also, in terms of respect for rule of law, it also is not something that is part of the, in large part, part of the consciousness or just the practice, if you will, because of the justice system is in huge need of reform and so forth. So what can you do if you don't have the institutions that we would take for granted here in the United States? What do you do instead? And I think you have to rely on what the resources, the cultural resources are in the country and on the local level in the community. What do they value? There's a lot of value around family. There's a lot of value around religion, around faith in these communities. Those are resources. Those and civil society. Those are local capacity. What I would call local capacities for peace. And they aren't. And they are operational. We don't hear about them. Nobody writes about them. Nobody researches them. But I just myself on my last trip, I was in conversation with the group that we were working with, and asking them about how do you resolve conflicts in your community. With the absence of access to justice, very few people have access to courts and so forth, and even if they speak French and there's no Creole, and it's a huge problem. So what do? Unfortunately, there is what they call private justice and revenge that takes place. There's that, but there's also the system of notables, of people who are respected in their community, and if there's a dispute with the families or the neighbors or whatever, they go to this person to ask them if they will help to resolve these notables. I actually tried to research it myself after I got back to see, what I could find out. If I couldn't find anything about it. Actually, the research assistant I asked couldn't find anything about it, so I have to do my own. I don't know, but it goes to show you that there are resources that we don't actually exploit as much as we could do, or that we don't recognize and support and validate as much as we could. So if, for instance, a number of these people were already playing this informal role in their communities of resolving conflict, so why not just support that role that they already do? They already are organized as initiative committees. They already have this role of organizing communities and have trust of the people. For instance, there was an example of one community member that I talked to who held dialogues between the police and the community in their town in the lead up to the elections. And the police, the community was very distrustful of the police in terms of their role and in terms of faith in their ability to maintain security during the elections. And what this IC member told me was that he noticed a big difference in how the police performed on the day of elections as opposed to previous times. And the reason he thinks that there was a difference in their performance was because the police felt accountable to the community once they had met in dialogue with them. They, you know, they got to know each other and talk about their expectations and roles. There was, so.
I wonder how we encourage that on a grander scale, right?
Right.
Like, how do we encourage the government to come to the table with civil society organizations that they haven't traditionally had to meet with or had to pay attention to?
That is the million-dollar question, because that's something that is it is not happening. Generally, you know, in my experience, government will not invite people to the table. You have to be asked to be included at the table. You have to put pressure to be included at the table. International actors can certainly encourage it in terms of facilitating that conversation and that connection. In USIP, very often in the places that we've worked, we actually have used training workshops as a sort of an entry point, as a way to engage people who don't normally engage with each other. I've done a lot of work in Iraq, and a lot of what we do in the programs is we bring civil society leaders and government people who may be interested in the same issue, whether it's education or human rights or whatever it is, and we'll bring them to a workshop where it's a learning opportunity. So they're not there to really talk about necessarily directly what the issue is, but they're there to learn, and just that interaction where people get to know who is who and learn about their roles, that promotes more of a dialogue between government and civil society. So that's one strategy that I think can be helpful. You find ways to bring people together with the idea that that will promote more interaction down the road.
Other questions? Well, I have another question, because you mentioned Iraq, and Iraq obviously has a very large displacement problem as well, although it's from a conflict, not from a natural disaster. How does displacement affect the ability of civil society to engage with communities, or what do you think from your experience in Iraq and now in Haiti, and also your experience in Colombia?
Yeah. How does it affect civil society's ability to engage with the displaced communities? It's again, it's very challenging. What civil society can do that perhaps ordinary citizens can't do, and where I draw the distinction again is civil society organizes around a certain issue, around a certain problem that they want to do something about. And they're usually informed by certain values. So if it's a civil society organization that's dedicated to conflict prevention or conflict resolution, or a civil society that is dedicated to improving human rights or providing access to aid or something like that, depending on their mission, their focus, the values that inform that, they can have access and credibility with even displaced communities, and they have a mandate to address human rights issues, for instance, or any other issue, and don't and shouldn't, at least if they're legitimate, discriminate among people who need this kind of service. So they operate in a certain space, I think. Even when you're dealing with displaced communities, they're operating in a certain space. They're service oriented. They're about reaching out. So even though certainly displaced communities also create a certain amount of conflict with when they are displaced to a community with other residents. And that certainly has happened in Iraq too. So civil society can also play a conflict prevention and resolution role in helping people to understand what, you know, the reasons for displacement, the effects of displacement, the consequences. I mean, obviously these are huge challenges, but in the absence of institutions, functioning institutions, functioning government, civil society is pretty much what you got.
Yeah. So what activities do you think are needed going forward to strengthen the role of civil society in Haiti? And perhaps how can we generate more civil society actors that are really engaging both in a peacemaking role but also in the political process in general?
Well, first of all, I mean, the great power of engaging civil society, I think, resides in the fact that people want to have control over their lives. So even though they've been through an earthquake, they've had a lousy government, and they've had war, or whatever it is, calamity that has been visited upon them, they want to exercise control over their lives. They want to have an impact. They don't want to be treated like a basket case. So when you give people opportunities to actually say, if you tell them you can do this, you can be a part of the solution. There are things you can do, even though you can't fix the whole problem. People generally respond to that call. Because most people would rather think that they can do something than have to sit at home and wait for somebody to do something for them. So there's an energy, there's a will, there's a natural will and desire for people, no matter what their education, no matter what their circumstances, to do for themselves. And unfortunately, very often the aid community, the international community, saps that natural will and capacity and resilience and desire for people to do for themselves, and for communities to come together and do for themselves. Because if there's one advantage to disaster, one beauty, the disaster is that it brings people together and generally brings out this desire to help and each other. And that very often gets squashed because the international community thinks, oh, we need to send all these things and so forth. And yes, resources are needed, but not at the expense of taking the decision making and will and desire of local people and capacity. You can't give aid at the expense of negating what people can do for themselves. So I don't think we have that. That balance is there. I mean, it's one of the reasons I like to work in education and training versus aid is because in education and training, at least I know that I'm building capacity, and that I'm hopefully working from what people already have and validate what they already can do. But I get concerned very often with how aid can sometimes the process that it's used to distribute aid can very much sort of exacerbate problems and breed the kind of dependence and lack of change. It can breed corruption. I'm going on and on. But anyway.
So what is your advice to aid actors in Haiti?
Respect what civil society and local people say they want and need. I mean, we keep hearing that they know what they want and need, but lack the resources to do it. The message, I think, is to know when to get out of the way, and to also know how to be conscious of the process that is used to deliver aid, to make sure that it's not contributing to conflict, not contributing to corruption, that it's truly actually making the difference, the desired difference. I mean, that's.
Are there any other questions in the audience or comments? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming today. This has been a very fruitful discussion, and I hope that we can all continue to have the same discussion and build upon this knowledge. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. All right.